My name is Raymond Lewis. I'm 82 years old, and for the last 3 years, I've lived alone in a modest one-story cottage just outside Madison, Wisconsin. I used to teach American history at the local high school for over 3 decades, and I was proud of that. I still have a few old yearbooks on my bookshelf, faded covers, bent spines. And sometimes, when I feel especially adrift, I take one down and run my fingers across the pages, looking at the young faces I once taught. Some of them became doctors, some lawyers, some vanished into the noise of life. One of them even sent me a Christmas card every year until last year. Maybe he died, or maybe he just forgot. People forget the old. I've come to understand that. I used to live with my wife, Ellen, in this same cottage. We bought it in 1978, right after our daughter, Sarah, was born. It had a red door back then, which Ellen insisted on keeping despite the neighbors' protests that it wasn't subtle. She said red made it feel alive. Now the paint has faded to something closer to rust than crimson, and I haven't had the energy to repaint it. Still, I leave it that way, as if it might summon her back. Ellen died 5 years ago, 3 weeks after our 45th wedding anniversary. One morning, she didn't get out of bed. I remember the details with unbearable clarity. The tea still hot on the bedside table, the newspaper folded to the crossword she hadn't started, the faint scent of her lavender lotion on the pillow. The coroner said it was her heart. Peaceful, they said, as if that word could somehow soften the finality of it. I remember sitting in the kitchen that night with a glass of milk I never drank, watching the digital clock on the microwave blink 12, 12, 12, like it was stuck in time, too stunned to move forward. After Ellen died, Sarah came less frequently. At first, she visited every week, then every other, then once a month. I didn't complain. She had her own life, her career, her husband James, their 2 children, and a modern house in a gated community 30 minutes away. She always came with a bottle of kombucha or some quinoa salad she thought I should try. "You've got to look after your gut, Dad," she'd say, as if my digestive health was the only part of me that mattered anymore. But lately, even the quinoa stopped coming. Calls became texts. Texts became silence. Sarah is 48 now. I remember the day we brought her home from the hospital like it was yesterday. Ellen was exhausted but glowing. Sarah was wrapped in a yellow blanket Ellen's mother had knitted. She had a strange little birthmark on her shoulder that looked like a comma, and I joked that she was the start of our next sentence. For the first 10 years of her life, she adored me. We read bedtime stories together, watched Little House on the Prairie, and I taught her to ride a bike on the street out front. But something changed after college. She became harder, less willing to listen, more interested in control than conversation. I blamed James. He was always polite, always civil, but there was something in his smile I never trusted. Something rehearsed, like a man who learned affection from watching daytime TV. James worked in finance, or real estate, or maybe he just said he did. His job was always described in vague, upward-moving terms. I manage portfolios. I facilitate high-net acquisitions. The sort of language that sounded expensive but meant little. I never asked too many questions. That was Ellen's approach. Don't interfere. Let them live their lives. And so I tried to stay out of it, even when Sarah stopped bringing the kids over and started sending birthday cards instead of showing up in person. I told myself they were busy. I told myself it was normal. But in the quiet corners of the night, I could still hear Ellen's voice, soft, tired, and just a little sad, saying, "It's not how I pictured growing old. I have my routines now. I wake up at 6, always have. Old habits. I make oatmeal the way Ellen used to, with cinnamon and a touch of brown sugar. I water the plants she loved, but which now sag a little more each month. I take a slow walk around the block if my knees allow it. I read the newspaper with a magnifying glass and mutter at the editorials like someone's listening. I still pay for cable, even though I mostly watch the same 4 programs. Jeopardy, Mass, reruns, Antiques Roadshow, and every night before bed I sit in Ellen's armchair and talk to her. Not aloud, just in my head. I tell her what the weather was like, what the robins in the backyard were doing, whether or not Sarah called. She rarely calls now, but when she does, her voice is brisk and efficient, like she's halfway through a meeting. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. Everything okay? You taking your meds? Good, good. Listen, I need to run, but we'll talk soon." Click. Still, I didn't expect what happened last month. Sarah called, unexpectedly, on a Sunday afternoon. There was something different in her tone. Softer, almost sweet. She said she and James wanted to come by. "We've been thinking about you a lot," she said. "We feel like we've been distant, and it's time to fix that." I remember blinking at the phone, stunned by her warmth. When she arrived, she brought lemon cookies, Ellen's favorite, and a stack of manila envelopes. "We want to help you simplify things, Dad," she said, her smile bright and gentle. "Life is too short for paperwork and stress. You've worked hard your whole life. Now it's time to rest. Just sign the papers, and we'll take care of everything." She patted my hand like a nurse might, opened the first envelope, and pulled out a sleek set of documents. I looked down at the forms. Some kind of power of attorney, health directives, property trust, but the text blurred together. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and I trusted her. I wanted to believe this was what she said it was, a gift, a gesture of love, an easing of burdens. "Just sign here, Dad," she said, "and here, and here." James hovered nearby, nodding. "We just want you to be comfortable. We'll handle the rest." And so I signed. I didn't know, at the time, what I was really signing away, but I would find out soon enough. The first week after I signed the papers, nothing seemed to change. I still woke up to the same creaking floorboards, the same sun filtering through the dusty blinds, the same silence pressing against the walls like snowdrifts. I still took my morning walk, waved at the neighbors who barely remembered my name, made my own lunch, and turned on the television just to hear another human voice in the house. Sarah didn't call that week, but I didn't think much of it. After all, she had seemed so kind, so sincere during her visit. Perhaps she was giving me space, letting the process she'd started unfold, without overwhelming me. I told myself that was considerate. I wanted to believe it was. On the 8th day, I went to the grocery store as usual. It's a small place, just a 10-minute walk away, run by a couple who've owned it since the Reagan administration. I've shopped there for over 30 years, and they still ask after Ellen, forgetting or pretending to forget that she's gone. I let them. It makes things simpler. But that morning, when I reached the checkout and tried to pay with my debit card, it was declined. I tried again. Same result. I offered to write a check, but the cashier gently reminded me that they no longer accepted them. I apologized, left my items on the counter, and shuffled home with an empty tote bag and a head full of worry. Once back in the house, I called the bank. A pleasant young man named Trevor informed me that my account had been frozen due to recent administrative changes, and that all inquiries should be directed to the account's legal representative. I was confused. What representative? I was the account holder. I tried to explain that to him, but Trevor only repeated, with the polite flatness of someone trained to handle the elderly, that I would need to speak with my daughter. "She's listed now as your financial proxy, sir," he said. "She's authorized to manage all transactions on your behalf." That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping realization that something was deeply wrong. I hung up, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the lemon cookie tins Sarah had left behind. I hadn't touched them. Ellen never bought store cookies. She baked, and the idea of opening that tin made my stomach twist. I called Sarah immediately. She didn't answer. I left a message. Then another. I waited a few hours, made some tea, and called again. That time she picked up, her voice calm, breezy even. "Dad, what's the matter?" "My account," I said. "It's been frozen. They said you're now, what did he call it? My financial proxy." "Oh, that," she said, as if I'd asked about a cable bill. "Yes, we processed that with the papers you signed. It's just a formality, Dad. It makes it easier for me to help you manage your finances. But I never agreed to give up control. You signed the power of attorney," she said softly. "We talked about this. It's for your benefit, so you don't have to worry about bills and paperwork anymore. You deserve to relax." I went to buy groceries and my card was declined. "You should have called me," she said. "I would have had them deliver. You don't need to run errands anymore. That's exactly the kind of stress we want to take off your plate." I said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I want access to my money." "Dad," she said, a warning in her voice. "Let's not turn this into something dramatic. You're still the beneficiary. Nothing's been taken from you, but you're getting older. It's time to let people help." The word help echoed in my head like a gong. Not protect, not support. Help, like I was already half dead, a burden to be carried, an object to be moved from place to place. A few days later, I received a letter from the county assessor's office. It was a routine property tax notice, but there was a strange addendum stapled to it. A copy of a deed revision showing that my home, the very roof over my head, was now held under something called the Lewis Family Living Trust. I hadn't created any trust, but there, in the crisp legal language, was my name as the former sole owner, and below it, Sarah's name as trustee. I blinked at the paper, read it 3 times, and felt my hands start to tremble. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Ellen's chair and tried to retrace every word Sarah had said when she brought those envelopes. She had said medical decisions, streamlining responsibilities, easing your burden. She never mentioned property. She never said I would be giving up the deed to my house. In the morning, I called the lawyer listed on the document, a man named Elliot Gressman. His assistant answered. "Mr. Gressman is in court today," she said. "Can I take a message?" "I need to know what I signed," I said. "My daughter brought me some papers. She said they were to help me, but now my money's blocked and my house isn't mine anymore." There was a pause. Then she said carefully, "Sir, are you Mr. Raymond Lewis?" "Yes." "Then I'm afraid Mr. Gressman can only speak with your appointed representative." "According to the documentation, that's your daughter." "I am the client," I snapped. "I'm the one who owns, or owned, the house." "I'm sorry, sir. I really am. But legally, Mr. Gressman must follow the instructions of the trustee now." I hung up and sat there in silence, trying to understand what had happened. I thought about calling the police. But what would I tell them? That my daughter tricked me into signing away my life. That I was defrauded by a smile and a tray of cookies. Would they even believe me? Or would they nod sympathetically and gently suggest I move into assisted living? I called the only person I thought might help. Henry Wallace, my old friend from the high school faculty. Henry had taught civics and coached track. He was tough, practical, and sharper than most men half his age, though he walked with a cane now and often joked that he'd become allergic to stairs. I told him everything, not in fragments, but all of it, from Sarah's first visit to the moment I saw the deed. There was a long pause when I finished. Then he said, "Ray, you need a real lawyer, not Sarah's, yours." "I don't have one." "You do now," he said. "I'll make some calls." That same afternoon, Henry put me in touch with a woman named Carolyn Greer, an elder law attorney in Milwaukee. She agreed to meet with me the next day. I packed my files, took a cab to her office, and spent 2 hours telling her the entire story. She listened without interruption, her eyes moving rapidly across each document. Finally, she looked up and said, "Mr. Lewis, I won't lie. You signed legally binding documents, but that doesn't mean you don't have options. If we can prove misrepresentation or coercion, if you weren't fully informed, there's a path to reversing this. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "There's one more thing," she said. "We need to find out exactly what access your daughter has. Bank accounts, property, insurance, anything in your name that's now under her control. And I need to know something else." She looked me square in the eyes. "Are you ready to fight her for it?" I didn't answer immediately. The truth was, I didn't want to fight Sarah. I wanted her to hug me again like she did when she was 10. I wanted her to remember the nights we sat on the porch watching fireflies. I wanted her to be my daughter. But I was beginning to understand that wanting wasn't enough. "I'm ready," I said finally, "because if I don't, there'll be nothing left of me at all." Carolyn's office became my only point of certainty in a world that seemed to be slipping out from under me one careful signature at a time. She was efficient, but never cold, and she spoke to me with a kind of respectful directness that I hadn't experienced in years. Not from Sarah, not from James, not even from the clerks, who now treated me like a relic from another century. I brought her everything I had, every document, every letter, the printout from the county, my old bank statements, and the original copy of the power of attorney that Sarah had insisted I keep just in case. Carolyn scanned each page with a sharpness that reminded me of Ellen when she used to balance our checkbooks down to the last penny. After a long moment, she looked up and said, "This wasn't just power of attorney. She's had you sign a revocable trust agreement. The property's no longer in your name. And since she made herself the sole trustee, she can now control and distribute every asset within it, including your home." I felt my stomach twist. I'd expected as much, but hearing it aloud, formally, legally, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Carolyn leaned forward, her elbows on her desk. "The problem is not just what she did, but how she did it. If we can establish undue influence, fraud, or lack of informed consent, we may have a case to reverse the transfer. But you'll need to prepare yourself. This will get ugly." She was right. Things began unraveling even faster than I had imagined. The first blow came just 2 days later. I received a call from a caseworker at the County Department of Aging. She introduced herself as Melissa Gant and said, in a kind but clipped tone, that she had received a request from my daughter regarding my living conditions. "It's a routine wellness check," she said. "Nothing to be alarmed about. Just to make sure everything's in order." I tried to ask what Sarah had told her, but Melissa remained vague, saying only that concerns had been raised. I agreed to the visit because what choice did I have? She arrived the next morning at 9 a.m., clipboard in hand, and proceeded to walk through my house as if she were cataloguing a museum exhibit. She made small talk, asked about my meals, whether I remembered to take my medication, and how I spent my time. I answered honestly. But her eyes were too kind, her smile too soft, like someone humoring a person who had no idea they were already halfway gone. Before leaving, she gently suggested I consider assisted living. "Just options," she said. "Your daughter's only thinking of your well-being." The second blow came when I tried to use my credit card to pay for some minor plumbing repairs. The plumber, a local fellow who had done work for us for years, was kind enough not to make a fuss, but the card declined again. I called the bank immediately and was told that the account had been placed under fiduciary restriction. When I asked why, the representative said that a medical recommendation had been submitted claiming early signs of cognitive decline. "That's impossible," I said. "I've never been diagnosed with anything." "It was signed by your daughter's physician," the representative said. "We assumed it was part of a guardianship process." My ears buzzed. Guardianship. That word circled my head like a vulture. I knew what it meant. Once declared legally incompetent, I'd lose all control over my affairs, my finances, my property, my choices. I would become a legal ghost, and Sarah, as guardian, would become my keeper. I called Carolyn in a panic. She told me to come in immediately. "Raymond," she said once I sat across from her desk. "They're moving fast. They've likely filed a petition or are preparing to. We need to act now." She arranged for me to undergo a full cognitive and psychological evaluation by independent specialists. "We need something concrete," she said, "to prove that you are of sound mind. We'll file a preemptive challenge to any guardianship attempt, and I'll file a petition to revoke the trust based on fraud and undue influence." The tests were grueling. I spent hours being asked to recall sequences, repeat stories, draw clocks, identify patterns. I felt humiliated, as if I were being asked to justify my own existence. But I passed, with flying colors. The neurologist said I showed no signs of dementia, no cognitive impairment beyond mild age-related forgetfulness. The psychologist said I was articulate, coherent, and demonstrated full capacity to make informed decisions. Carolyn took the reports and filed the necessary motions within the week. That's when Sarah called again. Her tone had changed. No more gentle suggestions, no more soft reassurances. "Dad," she said, "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're trying to help you. You're being manipulated by that lawyer. She just wants your money." I asked her why she submitted false medical claims. There was silence on the line. Then, in a voice as cold as winter glass, she said, "Because you're not thinking clearly anymore. You're acting paranoid, and if you keep fighting us, you'll only hurt yourself." I hung up. My hands were shaking. I sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the furniture Ellen had chosen decades ago, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not grief, but a new and terrible clarity. My daughter didn't see me as her father anymore. I was a resource. A liability, something to manage, silence, and eventually erase. The third blow came when I received a notice from a senior relocation service. It was a glossy brochure in a manila envelope, with a cheery handwritten note clipped to the top. "Hi, Mr. Lewis. Your daughter mentioned you might be considering downsizing. We'd love to help with your transition to a more supported lifestyle. Our community offers daily activities, medication management, and 24/7 on-site assistance. We even have bingo nights." I stared at the smiling stock photo faces on the front cover and felt bile rise in my throat. I'd never spoken to anyone at this company. I hadn't agreed to any relocation, but someone had, and that someone had already made decisions on my behalf. Carolyn told me we had grounds for a restraining order to prevent further action until the court could review our challenge. "But you need to be careful," she warned. "If she thinks she's losing control, she may double down. This is when people get desperate." I nodded, but I didn't really understand what she meant until the phone rang again 2 days later. This time, it was James. I hadn't spoken to my son-in-law in over a year. His voice was slick, smooth, practiced. "Ray," he said, "I just want to say I'm sorry it's come to this. We love you. Sarah's under a lot of stress. You've always been a little independent. That's admirable. But there's a time when we all have to face facts. You can't live alone forever. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't answer. He continued, "Look, just drop this thing with the lawyer. Come stay with us for a while. Let's talk things out like family. You don't have to go to court. That's ugly. Let's be civilized." I thanked him for the call and hung up. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the house quiet around me, my hands folded around a cold cup of tea, and I realized I had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back. I was no longer a father to be loved, consulted, embraced. I was a pawn in a battle over control and legacy, but I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. Not like this. The days following James's call felt like stepping onto a battlefield with no clear strategy, only the raw instinct to survive. Carolyn had arranged for me to meet with a geriatric specialist who was willing to provide a comprehensive evaluation on short notice. The doctor's office was a sterile place filled with muted colors and a faint scent of antiseptic that made me feel simultaneously nervous and exposed. The neurologist's questions were direct but gentle, probing my memory, reasoning, and judgment. Each test felt like an interrogation designed to measure my worthiness to remain independent, to continue living life on my own terms. I endured the hours with a mix of determination and exhaustion, knowing that my very freedom depended on the outcome. When the report arrived a week later, it was unambiguous. No signs of cognitive decline, full mental capacity intact. Carolyn filed it immediately as part of our legal strategy. But this victory was short-lived. Within days, the real storm hit. A formal petition for guardianship was filed by Sarah, supported by a private medical evaluation commissioned by her. The document painted a starkly different picture, one of confusion, forgetfulness, and an alleged inability to manage finances. The evaluator's notes were clinical but riddled with inconsistencies. I had never met this doctor. The tests he claimed to have administered were questionable at best. Carolyn called it a manufactured diagnosis, a deliberate attempt to manufacture evidence in court. It was a tactic designed to break me down, to overwhelm the truth with paperwork and conflicting testimonies. Court dates were scheduled with disheartening speed. I sat through hearings where my daughter's lawyer portrayed me as a feeble old man in desperate need of protection. They called witnesses, neighbors, acquaintances, even a nurse who had never seen me but testified based on hearsay. I watched Sarah from across the courtroom, her expression carefully controlled, her eyes unreadable. In that moment, she was no longer my daughter. She was an adversary, a stranger dressed in the clothes of family. Each word spoken against me felt like a blow, each question a reminder that my life was no longer my own. The most painful moment came when the judge asked me directly if I understood what was happening. I nodded slowly, my throat tight with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I understand that my daughter believes I cannot care for myself, but I am here to tell you that I am capable. I live alone, pay my bills, manage my medications, and maintain my home. I am not incompetent." The judge listened, her eyes gentle but resolute. "We will review the medical evidence and make a determination," she said. "This is a serious matter. Your rights are at stake." Those words hung in the air like a verdict already cast. During this time, Sarah's visits became less about concern and more about control. She arrived unannounced, rifling through my drawers, checking my calendar, and speaking to my phone service provider without my consent. I found letters unopened on the floor and bills piled up unpaid despite my efforts. It was as if she wanted me to fail, to appear helpless. I fought back in the only way I could, documenting every interaction, keeping detailed notes, collecting witnesses who could attest to my independence. Carolyn helped me compile a file thick enough to fill an entire briefcase. In the midst of this chaos, a surprising ray of light emerged. My granddaughter, Emily, Sarah's eldest child, reached out to me quietly, almost in secret. She sent me a letter, a handwritten note on soft stationery, full of remorse and empathy. She wrote that she had seen the way her mother and father treated me, that she was ashamed of their actions, and that she wished she could do more to help. She spoke of memories from childhood when I took her fishing by the lake, taught her how to bake cookies, and tucked her into bed with stories about the past. Her words were a balm to my wounded heart, reminding me that not all ties were severed. We arranged for her to visit me discreetly, and those afternoons together became my refuge. She brought warmth and hope into a life otherwise shadowed by betrayal. Meanwhile, Carolyn prepared a counter-petition to challenge the guardianship and dissolve the trust. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with experts, gathering affidavits, and carefully crafting arguments that emphasized my autonomy and legal rights. She reminded me that this was more than a legal battle. It was a fight for my dignity, my identity, and my very existence as a free man. We strategized about ways to expose the inconsistencies in Sarah's case and the questionable motives behind her actions. The court hearings stretched over months, each session draining but revealing. Evidence was dissected with ruthless precision, testimony was cross-examined, and character was on trial. In a pivotal moment, Carolyn presented the medical evaluations I had undergone independently, alongside sworn statements from neighbors and friends who vouched for my daily independence and mental acuity. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at Sarah, who sat rigid and silent. Then came the day when the judge issued a temporary ruling. I was allowed to retain control of my finances and property pending a full hearing, a small but meaningful victory. Sarah's guardianship petition was put on hold, and the trust remained frozen. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope that the nightmare might end. But Carolyn warned me not to let my guard down. Sarah was formidable, and this was far from over. Throughout this ordeal, I grappled with profound sadness and disillusionment. The daughter who once held my hand and sought my advice had become a woman wielding legal documents like weapons, severing bonds with cold efficiency. The house I had built with Ellen, filled with decades of memories and love, now felt like a battleground. But even amid the pain, I found a new strength within myself, an unwillingness to be erased, a determination to reclaim my life piece by piece. As the weeks passed, I continued to rebuild a semblance of normalcy with Emily's quiet support and Carolyn's steadfast guidance. I learned to stand taller in the face of adversity, to fight not with anger, but with resolve. And in the solitude of my small home, surrounded by fading photographs and the echoes of laughter long gone, I dared to imagine a future where justice would prevail and I would once again be the master of my own fate. The days following the judge's temporary ruling were quieter on the surface, but it was a silence that pulsed with tension, as if the very air around me had grown heavy with anticipation. Sarah did not call. James did not visit. The flurry of letters and notices that had dominated my mailbox in previous weeks suddenly stopped. It should have been a relief, but instead it felt like the silence of retreat before a calculated strike. Carolyn warned me not to be lulled. "She's regrouping," she said. "When people lose momentum, they either abandon the fight or double down, and your daughter doesn't strike me as the giving-up type." I knew she was right. Sarah never gave up when she wanted something. As a child, she would stand in the cereal aisle of the grocery store with her tiny fists clenched and her jaw set, refusing to budge until Ellen relented and placed the box of sugar-coated nonsense into the cart. That same will, once a source of pride, now felt like a looming threat. The first clue that something was wrong came not through the mail, but through the walls. I was sitting in the living room one morning, reading the paper with the radio murmuring softly in the background, when I heard the unmistakable click of the front gate. I looked up and through the curtains saw a man in a navy blue jacket walking briskly toward my front door. He had a clipboard in one hand and a large envelope in the other. I opened the door before he could knock. "Raymond Lewis?" he asked without looking up. I nodded. "I have a service notice for you. You've been listed as a defendant in a civil case regarding contested trust ownership and breach of fiduciary duty." I took the envelope with unsteady hands, already knowing the name that would appear at the top. Inside was a lawsuit filed by Sarah, alleging that my efforts to reverse the trust amounted to financial elder abuse, not against me, but against her. She claimed that I had been coerced into hiring Carolyn, that I was being manipulated by outside influences, and that by attempting to dissolve the trust, I was destabilizing the financial structure she had carefully constructed to protect her father's legacy. I brought the documents to Carolyn that afternoon. She read them silently, flipping pages, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is outrageous and calculated. She's accusing you of abusing her, of sabotaging your own future. This isn't just about money anymore. She's building a narrative that you're not only incompetent, but also dangerous to your own well-being." I didn't speak. I was still trying to understand how someone could twist the story so grotesquely, how my attempt to reclaim what was mine had been reframed as an act of aggression. "We'll respond," Carolyn continued. "We'll counter the allegations, present the medical reports, the affidavits, everything we've already submitted. But it will slow things down. That's what she wants. Delay, wear you out, force you to settle." That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like a ghost, touching the corners of picture frames, running my fingers along the worn edge of the kitchen table, listening to the creaks and groans of the house settling into night. Every room whispered with the memory of Ellen, her voice, her laugh, the way she hummed to herself when folding laundry. I missed her terribly, not just her presence, but the buffer she had always provided between Sarah and me. Ellen could soften things. She knew how to say the hard truths gently, how to bridge the widening space between us. But now, the distance had grown into a chasm, and no one remained to cross it. A week later, I received an unexpected visit from an appraiser. He arrived early in the morning, wearing a blazer and carrying a digital tablet. "Mr. Lewis," he said, "I'm here to inspect the property. It's part of the revaluation process requested by the trust administrator." I stared at him. "That's my daughter," I said slowly. "She requested this." He nodded. "Standard procedure for trustees managing family assets. It's usually preparatory, either for refinancing or sale." Sale. The word hit me like a slap. I had not given any consent to sell the house. I had not even been informed. I allowed him to walk the perimeter, but not to enter. I called Carolyn immediately after. She was livid. "They're laying groundwork. If they can't take control legally, they'll try to make your life so unmanageable that you either capitulate or they justify selling the home without your cooperation." Within days, the power company sent a disconnection warning, then the water utility. I had paid every bill meticulously on time. Carolyn discovered that Sarah, using her title as trustee, had attempted to redirect all correspondence and payment processing through a third-party financial agent who claimed I was at risk for neglect. I confronted Sarah in a phone call. She didn't deny it. "I'm trying to make sure things don't fall apart," she said flatly. "You've made it clear you're not thinking rationally. I'm doing what you should have done years ago, planning for the inevitable." I told her to stop. She laughed quietly. "You're going to regret this, Dad. You're making a mess of everything, and I won't be the one to clean it up when you fall." The final escalation came when a letter arrived from the county, an eviction notice, not because I had failed to pay, but because Sarah had filed an emergency motion to liquidate trust assets due to chronic non-compliance and diminished capacity of the resident. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Carolyn filed an immediate injunction, and the court issued a stay, but the damage was done. I felt hunted in my own home, each creak of the mailbox, each knock at the door, each unexpected car outside the window a fresh threat. In the midst of this siege, Emily visited again. She brought soup and sat with me on the porch while the sun dipped below the trees. I hadn't told her everything, only the pieces I thought she could bear. But that night, I told her more. I told her about the lawsuit, the appraiser, the eviction attempt. She sat quietly, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't understand how she can do this," she whispered. "She used to be different." I didn't answer. Maybe Sarah had changed, or maybe the seeds of this had always been there, and it was Ellen's absence that allowed them to bloom unchecked. "You don't deserve this," Emily said finally. "You gave her everything." Her words echoed later that night as I sat alone, staring at the envelope Sarah had sent with the trust papers months ago. "Just sign and rest," she had said. Those words had sounded like love then. Now they sounded like a lullaby sung before a smothering pillow was pressed to my face. But I was no longer asleep. I was awake, and I was angry, and I was ready to fight back. Not just in court, but with every ounce of dignity I still possessed. They had taken my name off the deed. They had frozen my money. They had questioned my sanity, my competence, my right to exist on my own terms. But they had not broken me, and they never would. The day of the final hearing arrived cloaked in the grey chill of late November, the kind of morning where the cold seems to hang in the air like breathless expectation. I rose early, too restless to eat, dressed carefully in my best suit, the one Ellen had helped me pick out over a decade ago for a retirement banquet that no one in the family had attended. I polished my shoes with slow, methodical movements and buttoned my coat as if preparing for battle. Carolyn picked me up precisely at 8. Her face was calm, but her fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the steering wheel, a quiet signal of tension I had learned to read like a second language. The courthouse itself was a squat, aging building whose yellowing linoleum and flickering lights did little to suggest justice lived within its walls. But as I stepped through the metal detectors and into the echoing lobby, I felt something deeper rise in me. Not just fear or pride or anger, but the raw, stubborn need to reclaim something sacred, something that should never have been taken. My name, my will, my very place in the world. The hearing was scheduled for Courtroom 4, a chamber I had visited only once before, decades ago, to testify in a school dispute. That day, I had been treated with respect. Today, I entered under suspicion. Sarah was already seated with her attorney, dressed impeccably in a dark green suit, her hair pulled into a neat bun, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me when I entered. James sat beside her, hands folded, his jaw tight. Emily was there, too, sitting quietly in the last row, her eyes searching for mine. And when they found me, she nodded, a small gesture of solidarity that gave me a flicker of courage I desperately needed. The judge was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a quiet voice that cut through the murmur of the courtroom like a scalpel. She reviewed the docket, summarized the matters before the court, and gave each side a chance to present its final arguments. Sarah's lawyer went first. His words were precise, polished, and deeply insidious. He spoke of a pattern of instability, of my alleged increasing paranoia and financial misjudgment, of Sarah's painful but necessary decision to intervene before irreversible harm could be done. He referenced the trust, the guardianship petition, the disputed financial withdrawals, and the restructured asset plan she had enacted only out of concern. He presented their private medical evaluation, the appraiser's visit, the redirected bills, all wrapped in the false veneer of responsible caregiving. Then it was Carolyn's turn. She stood calmly, placed her notes on the table, and began not with documents, but with my name. Your Honor, this is Mr. Raymond Lewis. He is not just a respondent on paper. He is not a case file or a tax number. He is a father, a veteran teacher, a homeowner, and until recently, a man who lived a modest, independent life with dignity. She spoke of the evaluations by licensed specialists, the false narratives, the misrepresentations, the unconsented legal transfers. She submitted affidavits from neighbors, friends, even the plumber whose payment had been blocked. And then she did something I hadn't expected. She turned to me. Mr. Lewis, she said, in your own words, please tell the court what this has meant to you. The courtroom was silent. My hands trembled slightly as I stood, but I looked directly at the judge, then at Sarah, and began to speak. I am 82 years old, Your Honor, I said. I have lived in the same house for over 40 years. I paid off every cent of that mortgage. I took care of my wife when she was sick, and I buried her when her time came. I saved, I planned, I taught. I raised a daughter. I believed that was enough. I never asked for luxury. I asked only to be left in peace, to live out my final years in the home I built, with the memories I've earned. I paused, breathing through the burn in my throat. My daughter told me to sign the papers. She said it would be easier, that I could rest. But those papers gave her power I never meant to surrender. Since then, I've been treated like a problem, a risk, a legal obstacle. She has called me forgetful, unstable, incapable. She tried to take my house, my money, my name, all in the name of love. I looked at Sarah then, and her gaze finally met mine. This isn't about protection, it's about control, and I ask the court, respectfully, to give me my life back. I sat down in silence. The judge asked a few final questions, clarifying dates, referencing medical evaluations, reviewing document trails. Then she recessed for deliberation. The room emptied slowly. Sarah rose and approached me in the hallway, her steps tentative. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not accusing but genuinely bewildered, as if everything that had transpired was some kind of theater she had no part in. "Because I have nothing left to give you," I said, "except the truth." She opened her mouth to respond, then thought better of it and turned away. We waited in a small side room, Carolyn and I, the clock ticking louder with every second. Finally, the bailiff called us back. The judge entered, sat, and spoke. Her ruling was firm. The court found no sufficient evidence of cognitive decline. The private medical evaluation was deemed inadmissible due to procedural concerns. The guardianship petition was denied. The trust would be reviewed for dissolution due to questionable execution, and Sarah was ordered to cease all fiduciary activity immediately pending full investigation. My rights were restored, my status reaffirmed. My freedom returned. I exhaled slowly, feeling something release in me, something I had carried for months, years perhaps. In that moment there was no triumph, no victory dance, only a profound, weary relief. Emily hugged me in the hallway. Carolyn shook my hand. Sarah walked past without a word. James followed, his face a rigid mask. I watched them go, a strange mix of grief and gratitude washing over me. The war was not entirely over, but the siege had lifted, and for the first time in a long time I was no longer afraid. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, a new stillness settled over my life, not the silence of dread that had haunted the house before, but a deeper, more deliberate quiet. a kind of earned peace. The mailbox no longer carried threats dressed as letters. The phone stopped ringing with vague inquiries from institutions pretending to care. There were no more strangers at the door with clipboards or eviction notices slipped through the cracks. My home was mine again, not just in legal terms, but in spirit. I walked through the room slowly each morning, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the doorknobs Ellen had polished with obsessive tenderness. Everything felt anchored once more, reclaimed. The nightmares that had crept into my sleep, visions of being locked away, labeled, erased, began to fade, replaced by long, dreamless rests and the quiet satisfaction of waking to my own life on my own terms. Carolyn continued to work on the dissolution of the trust. It would take months, maybe longer, but the process was underway, and she was confident the court's findings had given us a strong foundation. She checked in regularly, never intrusive, always respectful, and I had come to think of her not just as my lawyer, but as a kind of guardian in the true sense. Someone who protected not just my legal rights, but the idea of me as a whole person. Emily visited often too. She came with grocery bags and crossword books with soup and stories, and a presence that reminded me not all had been lost. She never spoke harshly about her mother, though I knew from the sadness in her eyes that she had begun to see the fracture in her family for what it was. Not a misunderstanding or temporary rift, but something far deeper and harder to mend. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch with the late autumn sun warming our faces, she asked softly, "Will you ever forgive her?" I thought about that for a long moment, then said, "Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's a path you walk beside. Some days I'll be closer to it than others." Sarah did not call. There were no apologies, no reconciliatory gestures. I wasn't surprised. I understood now that the version of her I had clung to, my little girl in the yellow dress, my eager student at the kitchen table, was a memory, not a reality. People change, or they reveal what they were all along. Either way, I had spent too many years squinting at the past, hoping to see the daughter I wanted instead of the woman she had become. The grief of that realization was sharp, but it came with clarity, and clarity, I'd learned, was its own kind of mercy. I made changes slowly. I cancelled the landline. I cancelled cable. I learned how to order my prescriptions online. I went back to the small grocery store where the cashier now greeted me by name and always double-checked that my card worked. I replaced the porch light. I repainted the red door, not because I wanted to erase Ellen's memory, but because I wanted it to shine again, not rusted, not faded, but bold, like it once was, like I needed to be. I wrote a new will. With Carolyn's help, I created a fresh estate plan, one that left clear instructions and no room for misinterpretation. I named Emily as my executor and included a handwritten letter for her, nothing dramatic, just truths I wanted her to carry forward. I also made a donation to the local library, in Ellen's name, and included a clause to fund a scholarship for future history teachers, a small way to keep teaching even after I was gone. When it was all signed, Carolyn asked how I felt. "Like I've come back into focus," I told her. "Like I'm not just surviving anymore." The house felt warmer now, not because the temperature had changed, but because the fear had left. I kept the radio on most mornings, the old jazz station Ellen used to love. I read more. I started journaling, just small entries, memories, thoughts, quiet observations. And every night, before bed, I still sat in her armchair, still talked to her in my head. But the words had changed. They were no longer confessions of helplessness or cries for rescue. Now they were simple notes from a man who had stood on the brink of being erased and stepped back with his name intact. One morning, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page in Sarah's handwriting. It said only, "I hope you're well. I'm sorry you think I betrayed you. I did what I thought was right. I don't expect you to understand. I read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Ellen's wedding ring. I didn't write back. There was nothing more to say. The winter came early that year, soft and quiet, snow settling like a blanket over the roof. I stood at the window one night, looking out at the yard, the light catching the frost along the glass. I had survived the theft of my autonomy, the assault on my identity, the betrayal of blood. And yet I was still here, whole, alone perhaps, but not diminished. And that, in the end, was everything.